Yep. So we're on presenter camera. Great. So you guys are all set for now. It's recording right now. Well, okay. I'll go ahead. I can pause it.
Thanks.
Maybe we'll get started.
And our tech people are, we just wonder whether they can hear me or not. Can you hear me or not? If, well, I should, yeah, it's on, it looks like, right? It's on. One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. One, two, three. 1, 2, 3. No. 1, 2, 3. No. 1, 2, 3. Is it working or not?
It's on, certainly.
It's on, but it's red, right?
Yeah, did you?
So I don't know what that means.
It's on, yeah.
Yeah.
You know, just light.
Okay. So yeah, it looks like.
Okay, great. Well, thank you, everybody. Welcome. My name is Graham Robertson. I'm the director of the Center for Slavic, Eurasian and East European Studies here at UNC. And I'd like to thank the center and particularly Natalia Bondarenka from the center for putting this great event on for us this evening, and thank also our colleagues at the Center for European Studies for their help in making this happen. It's my great honor tonight to introduce Serhii Plokhy. Professor Plokhy is the Mikhailo Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard University, where he also serves as the director of the Harvard Ukrainian Research Institute. Professor Plokhy was born in Russia to Ukrainian parents, grew up in Zaporizhia, and gained his undergraduate degree at what was then the University of Dnipropetrovsk. He also holds graduate degrees from Patrice Lumumba People's Friendship University, which I noticed they added Patrice Lumumba's name back onto the university in 2023.
Do you know?
Yeah, I didn't know that either. They dropped Patrice and now Patrice is back, which is, I think,
Okay.
actually, it's kind of interesting. It says a lot about current politics.
It is. It is.
And also graduate habilitation from the National University in Kyiv. Professor Plokhy taught first at the University of Dnipropetrovsk and then at the University of Alberta before being named the Khrushchevsky Professor of Ukrainian History at Harvard in 2007. He is the author of at least, that I could find, 18 different books on a very wide range of subjects, from the origin of Slavic nations to the Cold War to Chernobyl, and most recently to the Russo-Ukrainian War, on which he'll speak this evening. His work has been translated into many different languages and has received numerous prizes, including the Pushkin House Book Award in 2015, the Antonovich Prize that same year, and the Shevchenko National Prize for the humanities in 2018. Professor Plokhy, it's a great privilege to have you here tonight, and we're very much looking forward to your comments and to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thanks for this introduction, and thank you very much for coming here. The talk will be based on the book that was just mentioned, The Russo-Ukrainian War, that was published last year in May. And one particular aspect of that book where I will put most of the emphasis will be on the issues of democracy and the role of democracy in, first of all, road to this war, but also I will try to speculate about what this war can mean for the future of democracy. That's the idea. That's the plan. I will start with this image. Let me see whether I can move images. Do I have that power or not? Okay. Yes. This image that probably some of you had seen on. Okay, it was there and then it's fine. So let me see whether I can. Yes. Thank you. So it works. So well. Carlson Tucker is clearly puzzled here, and he is listening to roughly 25-minute talk on the history of Russia and Ukraine, and clearly he didn't do his homework. He didn't expect to get that sort of deep dive in the history of the Russo-Ukrainian relations and the causes of this war. He kept saying, for those of you who watched it, saying, okay, but why did you attack in February of 2022? And Putin would actually move 1 century forward from the 9th century to 10th century, and then the dialogue would continue. So one thing that is very clear from that interview, but also from anyone who was following texts that appeared under Putin's name before that, including a few months before, half of a year before the start of the war, on the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, but also his pronouncements that the issues of history are extremely important for Vladimir Putin. He sort of basically undermines by those publications and by those interviews the narrative that was pushed and is pushed by Russia before the war and got a lot of traction here in the United States. That it is NATO that is actually responsible for this war. NATO provoked Russia to attack Ukraine. If you listen to this interview, not even carefully listen to it. If you read those texts, not even carefully, it's very clear what is there on Putin's mind. And a big part of my research and book deals specifically with that aspect of the war and causes of the war. From my point of view, from my perspective, the best way to understand what is happening today in Ukraine is to take Putin seriously. And taken seriously means that basically understand that what he says, his argument, is basically an imperialist argument. This is a story of the Russian Empire, and more specifically, a particular imperial 19th century view of what Russian nation is. And at that time, the Russian nation, the big Russian nation, was imagined as consisting of Great Russians, Little Russians, or Ukrainians, and Belarusians, or White Russians. And this war, in many ways, is a continuation of the disintegration of the Russian Empire that started in 1917, continued in 1991, and we all believed that a miracle happened. The largest territorial empire in the world. You don't get to control 1/6 of the earth unless you're an empire. So the largest empire in the world somehow disintegrated without a major war. Either nuclear war, many people were concerned about that, or big regional war. So there were things like Chechnya, there were things like Georgia, and then annexation of the Crimea in 2014. But the vision was that those were just bumps on the road to potentially improved relationship. So the big war of the disintegration of empire was, in a matter of speaking, postponed. And that's what is happening today. But it would be absolutely wrong to try to just find one frame and one particular explanation for an issue as complex as is this war. And this war is the largest war in European history since 1945. This is potentially the largest war in the world since 1945, if you count the number of shells fired, if you look at the war as an industrial war. It's not the largest in terms of the number of troops on the ground, because Korean War had Chinese fighting the American army. So there you talk about the army in millions of people. This war didn't get there. But in terms of the scope as an industrial war, potentially it's also the largest war in the world since World War II. So the point that I'm trying to make, that this frame, disintegration of empire, is one particular frame that can explain many things. You can also look at that from the geopolitical point of view, a geopolitical perspective. And if there will be questions either on historical context or geopolitical context, I will be happy to answer them. So what I'm going to do here and now is focus on the issue of democracy and autocracy. So again, one of the very, very important aspects of the war, and especially the way how the Russia and Ukraine and the world in general got to that point. I will skip the previous 10 to 11 centuries. They were covered by Vladimir Putin before that. So I will start with the disintegration of the Soviet Union in 1991. The irony, of course, of the story, and really the one of the big important meanings of this picture, that's where the leaders of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus sign documents dissolving the Soviet Union, creating the Commonwealth of Independent States. The irony was that those were the representatives of the nations and republics whom Putin believes and Russian imperial historians believed was one Russian nation. So these are representatives of one Russian nation imagined by Putin, who actually have a very different imagination of who they are and what countries they represent, and they decide to dissolve the Soviet Union. At the time of the dissolution of the Soviet Union, there are high hopes in the world in terms of not just developments in the Soviet space, but in general about the start of the new era for the world as a whole. Francis Fukuyama writes first an article and then a book about the end of history, which basically means the victory of the liberal democracy. Now, there are references to that book, sometimes unfair, not fully understanding what the argument is about. I want to say that Francis Fukuyama got on a certain level that he got the picture right for Eastern Europe, and his official article was on Eastern Europe. But then trying to extrapolate that broader, that's where the issues were. And this really very optimistic view of the world, very optimistic view of the future, was based on the very specifically on the analysis, or at least understanding at that time, of events that were happening in Russia, not in the Soviet Union as a whole, not in Ukraine, not in Armenia, not in Azerbaijan. The eyes were on Russia, and the eyes were on Boris Yeltsin, standing on the tank, defending the White House, the Russian parliament, which was the symbol of democracy, not just for Russia, but for the world as a whole, for the post-Soviet space as a whole, and by extension to the world. Fast forward to 1993, the fall of 1993, the same White House in the background, the same tanks. Now they're not Soviet tanks, they're Russian tanks. And Boris Yeltsin is a very important part of the story of the defense of the White House and democracy in 1991, in August of 1991, and equally as important figure in the developments of October of 1993. So within a little bit more than 2 years, he wages 2 battles for the White House. He wins both of them. He wins the battle defending the White House. He wins the battle taking over the White House. So he survived, the Russian democracy didn't. And it's a very, very complex and complicated story, because the people who were defending this in 1993, the White House, those were a conglomerate on the communists and nationalists. So the hopes for democracy with them winning the battle were really zero, not next to zero, they were zero. And there were still hopes that Boris Yeltsin can bring this democracy, can produce that democracy. He rewrites constitution by the end of the year. And when the time comes to run him for the second term of as the president, and he is highly unpopular at that time, he gives a very candid interview to one of the newspapers, basically saying that, well, you really can't expect the overnight arrival of democracy into the country that has a long tradition of being ruled by the tsars and commissars and so on and so forth. Certainly something that by 94 people already start to understand and realize, but not thinking in those terms during the euphoria of 1990 or 1991. And basically his argument is that, yes, it's authoritarian constitution. Yes, it is a presidential constitution. But this is the way for me to save Russia from totalitarianism. So you see a leader of democracy who says, to bring democracy to my country, to Russia, I have to use authoritarian methods to get there. And the argument is accepted. Bill Clinton calls him and congratulates him on the victory in this confrontation over the Russian parliament. But the story is that 93 really very much starts the process of sliding Russia away from democratic developments for a number of reasons. Again, a very serious economic situation, a downturn that makes really the Great Depression in the United States looking like a very, very prosperous economic period compared to what the post-Soviet space goes in the 1990s. So the reasons are numerous, but the direction is very clear. Before Putin comes to power, there was Boris Yeltsin who created a constitution that allowed him to then use the powers of the presidency, of the super presidency, to really further centralize the power and lead Russia to what Russia is today. Again, in Russia, we always, after second elections of Boris Yeltsin, we always knew who would be the next president. There was no secret about that. There was no puzzle about that. There was no anxiety about that. And even less anxiety now, 1 month before the new elections in Russia. So that is the beginning of the end of the ideas associated with the end of history, the beginning of the end of the ideas that Russia would become a democratic country. It doesn't die there in 93 and 94. It's a longer process, but that's the beginning of the road that eventually would lead to what did happen? To really passing the baton from one ruler in Russia to another, using the power of the state, using the economic stimulus, and what is very important, using the mobilization on the issue of the war, because the Putin gets popularity in 1999 from 2% of being known or recognized to the overwhelming support by waging, or at least translating on TV, a particular type of the war that he wages in Chechnya. So Putin comes to power, first of all, of course, he's anointed, the power is passed to him by Yeltsin, but also the public support comes from the war, from the war in Chechnya. Let us now look at what is happening in Ukraine. As you see, there are three men on the screen. First is the first president of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk. And then comes Leonid Kuchma, and then Viktor Yushchenko. And if you look again, how many presidents there were in Russia since 1991, there would be 2, and in Ukraine, we have 6 by now, right? So there is one thing that is quite obvious. If you count them, there are 3 times as many presidents in Kiev than there are in Moscow over the same period of time. It doesn't necessarily mean democracy but on its own, but I will try to provide a little bit of background in terms of what is happening in Kiev at the same time when we already know, we are familiar with the story of the rise and high expectations about Russian democracy, and then it's sliding down. When Boris Yeltsin was on the tank, the leader of Ukraine, Leonid Kravchuk, at that time was trying to go between the raindrops. So he was not taking any particular stand. He was unhappy with the coup in Moscow around that time, but he was certainly not someone who was really leading the Ukrainians, and there were a lot of Ukrainians at that time certainly that were ready to go to the squares and ready to protest. He was not doing that. And generally, it was assumed that the Ukraine was in the hands of the old party apparatchiks, and Leonid Kravchuk was one of them. When Ukraine declared independence in the wake of the failed coup in Moscow, the representatives of the Russian democratic opposition from Moscow came to Kiev saying that, okay, talking to their democratic allies and counterparts in Kiev, saying, okay, what you are doing, you are stabbing Russian democracy in the back. You ally yourself with the communist elite in Kiev. The democratic opposition in the Ukrainian parliament says, no, this is not what is actually happening. But the point is that there is this image of rising democracy in Moscow and the image of the really partocracy and continuing control of the party in Ukraine. So very different situations and very different expectations at that time. But there is one thing that happens around the time or immediately after the Russian bombardment of the White House in 1993. The elite in Ukraine is very much, speaking again in terms of empires and disintegration of the empires, is sort of a colonial elite. They never run that place on their own called Ukraine. They really try to follow what is happening in Moscow around that time. And the crisis over the Russian parliament happened as the result of Yeltsin pushing a referendum strengthening the power of the presidency. Leonid Kravchuk in Kiev actually was trying to do the same. And like in Moscow, there is a resistance to these efforts to strengthen the power of the presidency. But in Ukraine, no one is firing at the parliament. No one is arresting anybody, but the new elections are being announced. And in 1994 a peaceful transfer of power, something that in the relatively free election, something that never happened in Russia, happens in Ukraine already in 1994. And this is happening against the background of actually much deeper economic crisis in Ukraine than the economic crisis in Russia for a number of reasons, but one of them, Russia had oil and gas, and Ukraine had to buy oil and gas. So, but there were other factors as well. So economy really can't explain on its own why democracy in Russia doesn't survive and democracy in Ukraine survives, because economic situation in Ukraine was much worse. There is a number of explanations of why Ukrainian democracy survives. When in 1990-91, everyone looks at Russia and thinks Ukraine is basically a very conservative Communist Party controlled part of the Soviet Union. The reason, again, there are different explanations. For me, as a historian, the one that I understand the best, that I certainly try to study and write about, is really rooted in the history of Ukraine, which is very different from the history of Russia. And what is different there is that for Russia, the state and the powerful state was always one of the centers of the identity of the elites, but also of the broader populace in general. For Ukraine came into existence out of a number of empires, which in Putin's mind make it basically not a legitimate state and not a legitimate polity. And it also came out of the development of the Ukrainian project that was building itself against these different imperial centers. So the opposition to the state was on the many levels the modus operandi for not just Ukrainian elite, but also for the populace at large. If not opposition, then looking for the ways how to find some sort of accommodation, but really get around the restrictions that were imposed by the state, which again, quite different from what we have in Russia. So regionalism of Ukraine, different languages, different religions, and overall tradition of looking at the state as something foreign, something that we don't fully trust, is at least in my opinion, one of the key reasons of why democracy in Ukraine survives despite worse economic situation than in Russia. Almost like the American colonies in the 17th century, the regions of Ukraine, they had to find some form of dialogue and conversation with each other. Later in the 21st century, you see an attempt of one of these regions, of regional elite coming from Eastern Ukraine, from Donbass, to take over all of Ukraine, and basically the entire project collapses. The leader of that group, President Yanukovych, is the only president in the history of Ukraine who didn't survive in office till the end of his first term. He had to flee to Russia. I'll get back to that later. So that's the again the 1990s story of Ukrainian development and Ukrainian democracy. By the year 2004.
Some guy from Harvard.
Okay.
From Harvard, so I would really hope he is.
Okay, it looks like there is more than one speaker here at the moment.
It's a challenge.
Okay, or maybe we're already in Q&A. Yeah, that's a sign. Just move.
This room is named for someone called Heckler, so.
Okay, good. So this is image coming from the Maidan protests of 2004. There are Ukrainian flags, there are European Union flags. And Ukrainians went on the streets actually protesting fraudulent elections, and they won the day. Fraudulent elections, not particularly Ukrainian phenomenon. It happens in many places, including in Russia, but basically the pushback in this particular case come from Ukraine. And the presidential candidate Yanukovych who wanted to declare victory, eventually had to become the leader of the opposition. There was a pressure on the Ukrainian government at that time, in particular President Kuchma, on part of already Vladimir Putin in Russia, to use force against people on the Maidan. And the anecdote has it that apparently President Kuchma told President Putin, you don't understand, Ukraine is not Russia. That became the title of the book that was published by President Kuchma. And what he had in mind was that basically the methods that are used in Russia to deal with the discontent don't work in Ukraine. You try to suppress the revolt, you get actually bigger revolt than you had before that. So the Ukrainian elites by 2004 realized that following in the footsteps of what was happening in Russia, having the sort of referendum that Yeltsin had, or trying to steal and manage elections like it was done by Yeltsin and then by Putin, it doesn't work in Ukraine. They really tried hard. They really tried hard to emulate what was happening in Russia in the 1990s, beginning of 2000s, and they got nowhere. So the big wisdom that Ukrainian elites acquired after 10 years of trying to run an independent Ukraine was that Ukraine was not Russia, and that was a big discovery also for them as well. So far, I was talking about the domestic politics in two countries. Now, whether country is democratic or autocratic or somewhere in between or on the road to one place or another is, of course, the most important factor is basically what is happening in the country. But democracy or no democracy has also a very important international dimension. Ukraine and Russia, to a degree, they happened to be on the border of the European Union that was extending in the 1990s and the beginning of 2000s. The European Union that declared itself actually to be a community of democratic states. So to be a member of a particular trade union or political union like European Union, there had to be you had to pass certain exams, and those exams were not just about economy, it was not just about the rule of law, it was also about democracy. And what you see by 2004, that if you think about Russia and Ukraine joining European Union and joining European structures, somehow Ukraine qualifies, Ukraine that in 1990 was not even close there, was not even on the horizon. And Russia, for which there were such high expectations, didn't qualify. So autocratic Russia just couldn't become part of the European Union. Forget geography and everything else. There are other issues. But on that particular issue of democracy or no democracy, suddenly Ukraine qualifies and Russia doesn't, which becomes a big headache for people in Moscow, for people in Kremlin, who around that time really working hard on the idea of restoring some form of a control over the post-Soviet space, because the vision there was the vision was formulated already in the 1990s by the Russian political elite. In particular, there was Prime Minister called Primakov. Around that time, the vision for the world was, okay, the Cold War is over, the bipolar world is gone. Russia, economically and otherwise, can't really go back and become one of the centers, one of the superpowers. So the vision should be the multipolar world. And in that multipolar world, Russia can emerge as one of the poles. Who needs multipolar world if you are not one of the poles, right? On par with European Union in the West and China in the East. But to get there, you really had you had in one way or another to control the resources of post-Soviet space. Ukraine in that vision occupies a special place. The Soviet Union in 1991 fell very much, at least in its last stage, on the issue of Ukrainian vote for independence. The vote took place on December 1st, 1991. By December 8th, 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. Question why? Balts declared their independence before. In 1990, Lithuania, in March of 1990, Lithuania declared its independence. You look at the question of Ukrainian referendum, there is no question about the Soviet Union. The question is about the Ukrainian independence. The idea is, okay, we want our country to go independent and the rest, just long live Yeltsin in the Soviet Union or whoever. But both Gorbachev and Yeltsin at that time didn't imagine the Soviet Union or didn't consider that economically and otherwise and culturally viable without Ukraine, because Ukraine happened to be second largest Soviet republic at that time, and then in the 1990s, the second largest post-Soviet space in terms of the population and in terms of its economic potential. So any plan to bring back under control of Moscow the post-Soviet space really would be incomplete without Ukraine, but more than that, there would be a huge hole there. If the second largest republic is not part of your integrationist project, you have a problem. And that's very much the story that I believe explained the best the question that Carlson Tucker asked Putin, why did you attack in 2022? But I would change 2022 and 2014 because the war really started in 2014. In late February of 2014, the Russian special forces take over the building of the Crimean parliament, drag in the deputies of the parliament and tell them how they're supposed to vote. Why that happened? Before that, December and January of December 2013, January 2014, you see the events that are known as the Euro Revolution, European Revolution, and then later become known as Revolution of Dignity. The story is sort of familiar for Russia and Ukraine. There are students on Maidan in Khreshchatyk, and Yanukovych, who was at that time president, really takes a page from the Russian textbook and uses riot police to disperse the students, and they beat up the students. What happens in Moscow with the Bolotnaya Square? Actually, people unhappy protest, but they go home. What happens in Kyiv? People leave their homes and 500,000 camp on Maidan. Forget Europe, forget every other things. We are not allow the police to beat our children. So Ukraine was not Russia from that point of view. So you got, after use of the riot police, you get 500,000 people on the street saying, okay, we are not accepting that. Yanukovych is gone in February of 2014 after the massacre really occurs on Maidan, with demonstrators being now not just dispersed, but being killed. And he flees to Russia eventually. And Vladimir Putin uses this opportunity to annex Crimea in late February and March of 20. 2014. So these are developments in Kyiv. Now let me shift a little bit focus and talk about the geopolitics of the story. Why students appeared on Maidan, on the square? They appeared, and students, but also some young urbanites in Kyiv, they appeared there to protest a sudden turn in the policy of Kyiv that promised Ukrainian citizens for 1 year to sign association agreement with European Union, and then suddenly turned around, getting $16 or $15 million bribe from Putin, and saying that we are not doing that anymore. And people went on the streets. Now, why Putin decided to pressure Yanukovych? Why he decided to force him to do something that was absolutely, for him as a politician, a suicidal mission? Why he was prepared to give this money? The trick is that if Ukraine would sign association agreement, and eventually did sign, the conditions of the agreement were such that Ukraine would not be able to join the Eurasian Union that Putin was building at that time. So Ukraine effectively was living Russian sphere of influence. So far, I didn't mention once the word NATO, right? Because the start of the war was not about NATO. I can talk about NATO in 2008, Bucharest summit, and so if there are questions. But the war is not about NATO and Ukraine's membership in NATO. The war is not about Ukraine's membership in European Union. The war is about trying to preclude Ukraine from signing association agreement with European Union, because automatically Ukraine would leave the Russian sphere of influence. So it's an attempt to restore and rebuild the control over the post-Soviet and former Russian imperial space, which is at the core of the early decision of 2014 to go to war with Ukraine, take over Crimea, start the so-called hybrid warfare in eastern Ukraine. This is the map of European Union and the one of the maps of the Russia-centered Eurasian Union. Again, the names and the names of the particular agreements differ, and as you can see, Ukraine is right there in between. Neither blue nor yellow. So that's the story of 2013 and 2014, and going back to the theme that with which I started, the theme of democracy, Ukraine qualifies, right? Ukraine qualifies as a democratic country to really then be on the path, potentially, again, no one believes in that at that time, but potentially on the path for the European Union. So this is one of the scenes from the taking over the Crimea. This is the map that emerged as the result of taking over the Crimea. Ukraine is presented with ultimatum, basically federalization of the country, which means really turning the country into confederation, with individual regions, including the Donbass, having the veto power over any foreign policy decisions in Kyiv. So basically stopping the drift toward Europe, changing the Ukrainian constitution, and so on and so forth. The two Minsk agreements followed. The president of Ukraine at that time, Petro Poroshenko, tried to change the constitution. He got the beginning of another Maidan and backed off. Ukraine was not Russia. And the war of 2022 is basically on at least one level is the recognition that the attempt to stop Ukraine's movement toward the West failed. The idea to bring the Russia-controlled Eastern Ukraine and Donbass into the constitutional field in Ukrainian politics, and in that way influence those politics, actually failed. And the war, this is the first day of the war, the Russian troops took over the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. So the photo comes from there. This is the map of Ukraine, plus minus the front line has not been moving much since the fall of 2022. Now, what the Ukrainians are fighting for? Before the start of the all-out war, there was Washington and Moscow disagreed on everything. But there was one thing where there was unspoken agreement, and not just in Washington or Moscow, in Brussels and everywhere else. The expectation was not more than expectation, it was a belief that Ukraine would not last for more than 2 weeks. Kyiv would not last for more than 3 or 4 days. The US was threatening Russia that if Russia invades, US would actually supply small arms to the guerrilla units on the territory of Ukraine. So the idea was that the expectation was that Ukrainians would resist, but it wouldn't be the state. It wouldn't be the army, but more like what Russian propaganda called it, that nationalist battalions or nationalist units. And that didn't happen. The biggest mistake, in my opinion, of Russia attacking in 2022 was believing that they very much attacked Ukraine of 2014. And major changes happened in Ukraine. Also, some of them directly related to the democratic processes that were happening in Ukraine around that time. Okay, it got frozen. Good. So I will try to speak without slides, and we'll see whether he's still capable of doing that or not. What happens is that after the existential, okay, good. So we have a dramatic change in the electoral map of Ukraine between the year 2014 and the year 2022. So these are two presidents. Petro Poroshenko was elected in May of 2014, and then Volodymyr Zelensky was elected in the spring of 2019. That's how the electoral map of Ukraine looked like in the year 2010. And that was pretty much the story of Ukrainian independence up to 2012. So it was almost like the United States. There were states or regions that were solidly in one column or in another column, and then there would be a number of regions in the center that would shift their allegiance, and then that would bring power either to pro-Western candidates who were mostly orienting themselves toward electorate from the central and western Ukraine, or eastern and southern. So country was divided, and the situation was much worse than in the United States because of geography. It just cuts the country in half. This is the electoral map of the election of President Zelensky, 2019. If you think that this is just because a particular political talents of Zelensky, and we certainly discovered him as a very talented politician, partially yes, but there is nothing new in terms of this map compared to elections of his predecessor, Petro Poroshenko. The only thing that Poroshenko lost the same roughly territory in the east, and Zelensky lost roughly the same territory in the west. But both of them, that was landslide. So Ukrainian electorate that was divided between 2014 now became united for a number of reasons. First of all, because the most historically pro-Russian electorate in the Crimea and in the East were not anymore part of the political process in Ukraine, but also because the rest united over the issue of protecting Ukrainian sovereignty and Ukrainian state, which turned out to be a historically very important turning point in Ukrainian history. At the beginning of the lecture, for those of you who still maybe remember that moment when we started, so I was telling you that there was differences between Russia and Ukraine, and Russia it's all about state, or a lot about state, and Ukraine it's all about against the state. So for Ukrainians, it was very difficult actually to domesticate the state, to look at the state in the 1990s and after that as basically something that represented their interests, something that didn't come from outside. And with the start of the war in 2014, between 2014 and 2022, Ukrainians actually discovered their state as something that was theirs, something that they could influence. The state conducted a decentralization reform between 2014 and 2022. Once the Russians moved in and probably expected more or less the same confused response that they got in 2022 in the Crimea and Eastern Ukraine, or even support, the people in the Russian-speaking cities and towns were marching under Ukrainian banners. And the biggest heroes became the mayors. The Russian occupational forces were actually kidnapping those mayors. And people were going there and going on the streets and trying to get them back. Completely unexpected development, not only for the Russian occupational forces, but also for many outside of Ukraine and in Ukraine. Ukraine really was able, since the start of the war in 2022, transform itself into the country that refused to surrender in February of 2022. Something that, again, no one expected, something that the sort of the processes, and those were processes within the society, within the country, including democratic processes that actually were not on the map, they were not visible. I attended dozens of round tables before the start of the all-out war with a lot of military experts. It looked like the Ukrainian army didn't exist. And I certainly trusted my colleagues who were experts on that. None of them discussed Ukrainian army as such, or there was real expectation of people rallying around the local institutions around Ukraine as a state. And when journalists go on the front lines and ask people there what you are fighting for, very often, not always, but very often, there was the variation of the same answer that it was they were fighting for democracy. Because Ukraine fights the war in two languages, in Russian and Ukrainian. Ukraine fights the war where the president is actually not ethnic Ukrainian, but of a Jewish background. Where now the commander-in-chief of the armed forces was born in Russia and is Russian. And Minister of Defense is Crimean Tatar. Not to diminish the importance of Ukrainians in that story, but just to give you a number of examples that really you deal with a political nation there. And political nation can't be united, especially in bilingual country, over just one culture or another, one language or another, or one religion or another. You need different unifying ideas. And idea that I can go and elect my mayor, and I can go and elect my president, if I don't like him or her, I can re-elect them, is basically very, very deeply seated in Ukrainian history, and certainly manifests itself today. We know the outcome of those elections even before they started. We don't know what will happen in Ukraine once the elections would be there. elections of the president were supposed to take place if there would be no war in a few, not in a few weeks, but in a few months. They are being postponed, despite, at least this is my understanding, despite the fact that President Zelensky actually would want to have those elections. But the people of Ukraine saying, okay, we don't want elections in the middle of the war. And we don't think that it would be a fair process because basically the government in the conditions of the war really controls the major news channels. So that would be bad for Ukraine. That would be bad for democracy. So the elections are being postponed. We don't know how they will turn out eventually and what will happen there. We certainly know what will happen in Russia next month. And now concluding remarks about this war and democracy in general. This is the map that shows not probably 100% in terms of the overlap, but close probably to 100% overlap in terms of the countries that support Russia today are, let's say, not democratic countries. And vice versa, the countries that support Ukraine are, at least the major countries, are democratic countries. Which again gives a new dimension to this war as the battle for democracy, not only in terms that Ukraine miraculously managed to preserve democracy through the 1990s and then actually developed it later, and Russia didn't, but also in terms of what is happening in the world. We know that democracy is under attack and not just in Eastern Europe. Democracy is under attack in this country as well. So what will happen in Ukraine really will have a major impact on a number of levels, geopolitical, economic, and so on and so forth, but also in terms of the future, defining the future of democracy. I started saying how big this war is, in terms of the number of people, in terms of the number of shells, in terms of the sort of the industrial warfare that is being fought. The largest in Europe since World War II, for sure. So it matters how the wars of those proportions end. We know how important was victory in 1945 and the fact that the Western allies were in Western and partially Central Europe, and the Soviet Union was in Eastern Europe. We know how it ended, and we know how long that story of East European and Central European countries trying to get out of that authoritarian embrace lasted. So this war, just because of its scope, is extremely important factor of the international importance, and it is of major importance for democracy and future for democracy as well. Thank you very much for your attention.
Terrific. Thank you so much for that. We're now going to turn to you, the audience, for questions. We have people with microphones on this side. So if you want to ask a question, can you raise your hand and we'll get a microphone to you. That would be great. Let's start here with Sasha.
Is will the color supports condemns Russia? Doesn't that actually the growing division, for example, in the United States and some other countries, in terms of support? Is there another dimension in this war that we need to consider, which is essentially, Putin likes to say, East against West or whatever?
Yes, thank you very much for this question. Ukraine has a very difficult task to convince the countries of quote unquote global South that somehow this war is important for them, that it is the war of the disintegration of empires, the sort of the wars that most of them were fighting. And the response is mixed, let's put it that way. I know that some people are saying that, first of all, Ukraine should drop word democracy when it appeals to the global south, because many countries there are not democratic, and talk in different terms. But it turns out that the argument that Ukraine is fighting the war against the continuator of the largest empire in the world doesn't work, because the anti-colonial attitude in general is very Europe-centered and Western-centered. So the ideology of these countries came into existence in conditions of fighting against the Western empires. For many of them, extremely important factor is race and racial divisions. And they don't recognize in Ukraine's war against Russia, first, they don't recognize Western Russia, and second, they don't recognize that there are racial agreements, racial divisions. So the idea of empire, not only here, but also in the former Western colonies, is actually a very Western concept. Somehow it doesn't include the Mongol Empire. Somehow it doesn't include the Russian Empire. And that's a big issue. The factor that really works, and in some countries of Latin America as well, is the more legal nature. The argument of a sort, look, we are all, there are very few countries who have that have nuclear weapons, very few countries that have huge armies. There is no war in the world because the smaller countries are protected by international law. And this war is the first war in Europe since 1945, when one country actually not just attacks another, but also annexes its territory. So that's in terms of the different frames, different language that is being used, and how it resonates in different parts of the world.
And here in the United States, the support of Ukraine is not at the level we would want to see it. Is there a crisis of democracy and general crisis of the West about which Putin repeatedly speaks? Forget about what he says, but if we look at ourselves.
One thing that is very clear, that there is a big issue with democracy and continuation of democracy in this country, right? We all know the attack on the Congress, and we deal in a situation where really American democracy is in danger. And it is not in danger because what Putin is doing or not is doing. It is basically because a big part of population here is really disillusioned, or maybe there are stronger words than that, in the way how the political system works, and is prepared to attack democratic institutions. So it's a major issue here. When you look at Europe, they are democratic countries, but it's not liberal democracy that is there. You see that a lot of people like Orban in Hungary, the government of Kaczynski in Poland, and so on and so forth. So this populist government, this populist trend is there. And it really corrupts democracy. Now, as a historian, I look at that and I unfortunately recognize some familiar things, some similarities with 1930s. You have Great Depression and you have Great Recession. And you have the rise of isolationism and xenophobia and populism on all levels. And we know what happened in Europe in the 1930s. Now, the difference between 1930s and now is that in some way the United States actually managed in the 1930s not to be part of the same processes that Europe was. But now this phenomenon of populism and attack on democracy is a global phenomenon. And in that sense, it's even more dangerous than, again, I don't want to be alarmist, but in that sense, in terms of the scope, in terms of the global dimension of the phenomenon, it is more dangerous than what we saw in Europe in the 1930s.
Yeah, please up at the back there.
Hi, firstly, thank you for an amazing talk. It's been really interesting. Secondly, this is a little forward to my question. Just a couple of days before the full-scale invasion, I just finished reading your book, Yalta 1945. So, and the first couple of days, I was really thinking a lot the question which I'm gonna ask you. So like in 1945, before that, we had Ukrainian government in exile, which appealed to United States, to Great Britain, was asked to help them to become independent after the Second World War will be finished. Because Ukraine tried to have their independent state for a long time. Back then, they ignored their pleas in order to appeal to Stalin, because Stalin demanded like Ukraine to be part of the Soviet Union. And right now, we're basically seeing the same players on stage. Instead of Soviet Union, we have Russia who wants to be like Soviet Union. We have Western bodies, and then we have Ukraine who's in the middle of it all. Why now people are actually listening to what Ukraine is saying? Why is it just because right now West is more likely to support Ukraine because it gives some kind of upper hand against Russia? Or is they actually recognizing Ukraine as individual and country and like the player on the stage as well as they are? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. My book on the Yalta conference that was published in 2010, I think you refer to it, yeah, to that book. It has a very interesting blurb from Zbigniew Brzezinski. And my publisher turned to him and he sent a blurb in which he wrote that, well, it's a very good book, not only about the past.
They are distracting.
Let's make a what?
We have to make good decisions. while
Oh
we
my
drive.
gosh.
Not only about the past, but also about the future. Then he continued, replace Poland with Ukraine and Stalin with Putin, and you will get the idea. I wrote to him saying that, well, I worked in Russia and some people helped me with the archives. I'm concerned that this blurb will be basically bad for them and for their careers. He immediately sent back, and there was a correction, and that's how it went on the book, that replace Poland with Ukraine, and Stalin with somebody whose name rhymes with his. And then I asked a colleague, who do you think it was? And she said, Sarah Palin? No. But replace Poland with Ukraine state. And that probably would be the closest parallel that we have now. And support for Ukraine today is certainly much stronger for the reasons that you said. Ukraine is an independent state; it exists there. It's basically an attack on the international order, but mostly because Ukrainians turned out to be surprisingly effective in holding the line and defending themselves. And that's there is a lot of things that come out of that war. And I keep saying that they come not out of this war per se, that they come out of the Ukrainian resistance, because if it wouldn't last for more than 2 weeks, we would be in a very different place now. Thank you.
Thanks for your speech. I was a little late, but it was wonderful. When we saw the electoral differences between, say, the 2014 election, 2019, obviously, you see that there's a dramatic change in the East. Obviously, there was a sea change, and now I think it'd be fair to say that actually the eastern regions of Ukraine that for a long time were dubious at times towards the Ukrainian national project have become sort of the Piedmont, actually the core of so much of modern Ukrainian nationalist nation building. To what extent would you say that this was due to the experience in between 2014 and the 2022 invasion that Eastern Ukrainians saw of life under Donbass? So from the opposite side of the border to the kind of criminal atrocities that were happening, the sort of petty criminal state that was being set up. I mean, to what sense would you say that this was like a repudiation of that, or how did that play in? I'm curious to get your opinion.
Well, I'm a historian, so I read stuff that is done by political scientists and sociologists. So what I'm going to share is basically my impression more than anything else, and it actually coincides or very close to what you just said. The story is that Ukrainians looking at Donbass, and there was, of course, the traffic going back and forth, and there were a significant number of refugees from Donbass. They realized what they had and actually started to value it, including issues, economic issues, of course, but including issues of democracy. And that was a big factor. Again, I can't confirm it. Because again, my own research, but as someone who certainly comes from Ukraine and visited Ukraine over this period of time, that's what I see there. Another major factor is that the not just people on the ground, but elites realized that the state was not just the instrument for some form of extortion. The state was something that also protected them. That certainly changed the discourse, the media discourse, and so on and so forth, and really marginalizing, not banning them, but marginalizing the Russia-backed and supported and financed parties and organizations, like one that was led by Mr. Medvedchuk. So that was another factor. So changes in the elites and also changes in the informational space. Those were the factors. And again, as I said, the reform, the decentralization reform really it shifted more money to the regions. So really, cities and localities and villages, people trusted people whom they elected, and they were the first targets that the Russians were going after. In every small village, in every small city, they were going after the local mayors. All elected.
Please, yes. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Can I ask a question online? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Please go ahead.
So the question is the following. Observation shows that.
I can't see. So.
I'm sorry.
So we have
Can
a
you
question
hear
in
me?
the room, and then I'll get to the question that's online. Okay, the question in the room, please.
Yeah. Not to like cast doubt, I think, but looking at Zelensky's term overall, I think he's I mean, he ran on anti-corruption and rooting out corruption. And I don't know to what extent that's been completed, if any. At least from what I've gathered, I think it's still a major issue. So I guess what is your opinion on the prognosis of the rooting out of corruption post-war, kind of from a historical standpoint and also maybe a little bit geopolitics? Yeah, especially I think under the backdrop of, if I recall correctly, he's dissolved the Verkhovna Rada twice, and he had some support from Kolomoisky and other oligarchs. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, you are absolutely right in a sense that this is the work in progress. It's not complete by any stretch of imagination. What we see, and I think this is a very important contributing factor to the fight on corruption, and certainly a very important turning point in the contemporary Ukrainian history. Zelensky really dramatically diminished the power of the oligarchs, both in economic terms. Partially it was diminished because of the destruction caused by the war, and many of them, their base was in the east. The city of Mariupol was destroyed. Azovstal, someone owned it. It was Mr. Akhmetov, the richest man in Ukraine. Mr. Akhmetov is not anymore owning TV channels and so on and so forth. So the anti-oligarchic law was passed by the parliament. So that is certainly one area where you can say that there is a visible progress. Another area where it is a visible progress is that actually people are removed quite routinely and very often put in jail and under investigation on the charges of corruption. There can be different takes on that, whether it's basically selective justice or not, and who is doing what. But that was not happening before in Ukraine. So another new development apart from the oligarchs. And from what I hear from people who are close to the government, they are convinced that Zelensky himself and generally the government or the majority of the government are not corrupt. What happened under Zelensky was that the one more step in the direction Ukraine, not Russia, occurred. Because before him, more often than not, President of Ukraine had model of Vladimir Putin in mind, becoming the richest man in the land. That was certainly the story of Yanukovych. That was, some people claim, was the story of Poroshenko, whose wealth actually increased when he was in the office and not the other way around. So we can't say that about Zelensky. So is the problem solved? No. But these three things that were not there before 2019, they are here today. So it gives you some hope.
Great. Is the questioner online still there?
Yes, the question online is still here.
Super.
So
Thanks.
the question
Go
is
ahead.
this. I'll explain the context and then I'll ask the question. The context is the US and probably Europe as well is losing interest to the Ukraine over the last 2 years. We can see it from things like, the top YouTube videos or like news, etc., that now is not including Ukraine. That's one part of it. The second part is that we don't see a wish in political elites in the US in particular, in Europe as well, to support Ukraine to victory. I think the current situation where the government is sitting on for $4.2 billion for presidential drawdown authority allowance and not using it, that's very clear indicator. And we don't see any, positive things from elections as well. So how can, and I understand one solution to that is to attract attention to Ukraine back to the point where it's comparable to what was in 2022. Is there anything similar in the past that you know from history where the situation was kind of going downhill the way it goes right now with support of Ukraine here in the US, and then the trend was reversed? What needs to be done to get this reversal?
Mhm. Well, thank you. What you said is all true, and there is a number of explanations. Suddenly, the death of thousands of people per day stopped being the news because that was also the news the day or the day before, and there is nothing newsworthy anymore, right? And we are moving on. That's part of the story. Second explanation can be, well, it becomes more and more costly, right? This is, I was kept saying it's the largest war and the war that no one was actually preparing to fight. And how many shells, and it looks like that the industrial capabilities are not there, and so on and so forth. So it costs money. And people asking questions, okay, what about our social issues and problems at home? Why we are doing that? Legitimate question. But there is one thing that I see certainly happening in this current war that maybe suggests a possible different turn of events. The war in 2022 started with really US leading and Europe being very reluctant to back Ukraine. So it's Olaf Scholz and Macron and whoever else, they were trying to position themselves as negotiators between the West and the United States and Russia up until June or July of 2022. And they stopped doing that when basically they were rejected by Putin. And he gave the award to Mr. Erdogan and not to them. But that's just to indicate you where Europe was in the first months of this war, in a very different place from the United States. Now the US is, of course, the country that everyone is in Ukraine looking and following the news of the battles in the Congress more careful and with more anxiety than people in the United States are doing that. But there was change in Europe. There was change in Europe in terms of really their determination to support Ukraine, and in financial terms, not the US is the largest supporter of Ukraine, it's European Union. The big numbers in terms of what US is doing and offering Ukraine. But these are all things basically that you put number on the equipment, including military equipment that is sitting there for last 20 or 30 years. That's why suddenly you see a headline in the news that, well, it looked like the US supplied actually to Ukraine $10 billion less than we believed that it supplied. Well, because this is the way how you do the estimate of your Abrams tank or something coming from the 70s or 80s, and whether you think it's an antique piece and that's why it's worth more, or it's basically it's already being outdated and it's worth less, right? So there are this kind of different approaches. So why Europe is taking actually a much more proactive position now than it was the case before? Well, because in Europe there came realization that what is at stake, it's not just Ukraine. At stake is their own security. And not only security of the Balts and the Poles, who were basically quite concerned from the start go, and were knocking on all the doors in NATO, in European Union, and everywhere else. But this realization comes to the European countries. So there is a change in Europe from 2022 to 2024 in a positive direction. And the change in the US can come or cannot come. Because what we see in Congress today, the majority of members of the Congress, like the majority of the people of the United States, support continuing assistance to Ukraine. But our political system is so dysfunctional for a number of reasons that we can't help ourselves. Forget about helping somebody else. And there are two things that are needed. First, realization in the US that what is at stake in the largest war in Europe and maybe in the world for the last 60 and 70 years are the interests of the United States. And that the deal that the US is getting in Ukraine is actually the sort of a deal that US never got. Ukraine is not asking for American troops. Israel and Gaza, the war in the Middle East, we have already American lives lost. At least if you follow the news, the reporting, there were Americans who died in Ukraine, but those were volunteers. Those were not people who were sent there by the government. And Ukrainians already destroyed, or maybe plus minus at least half of the Russian army. I don't know whether you watched that David Letterman's interview with Zelensky. Zelensky told him Odessa joke about two people discussing the war, and one of them is saying, "Okay, so what is happening?" Well, the other says, "Okay, Russia fights NATO," and the follow-up question, "And what happened?" Well, half of the army is already gone, and the next question is, "And what about NATO?" And the answer is, NATO hasn't arrived yet. That's only half of a joke. Oh, that's a real story. The NATO hasn't arrived. And so one thing is the change the way how we look at this war, because the question that is being asked is whether we want Ukraine to succeed or not, whether we want Ukraine to help or not, and if we do, to what degree we do that. The question that should be asked whether we want to help ourselves. So that's the key question. And then the second follow-up, whether we are able to help ourselves. I want to be optimistic and think that the answer to the second question and eventually to the first will be positive, but that's the only thing that can change the current tendency in the war. Thank you for your question.
Well, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I think that the fact that Putin speaks to Tucker Carlson and Zelensky to David Letterman tells us pretty much all we need to know about the situation. I wanted to say, first of all, a big thank you to Professor Plokhy for a very interesting and provocative, I think, presentation. We're going to carry this evening on. There is pizza next door. So we'll move into a more informal mode. So I saw one hand at least up there. If you want to come up with which Professor Plokhy questions in the pizza space.
Academically. Can I start one?
Okay, go on. Please go. I can never refuse an academic question.
Thank you. First of all, I already am loving the title of your next book, which is going to be Ukraine Saves Global Democracy.
I'm looking for co-authors.
Second of all, in this auditorium, I see obviously a lot of Ukrainian diaspora groups, a lot of Ukrainian refugees. I see phenomenal American supporters of the cause of Ukraine, those who have been helping Ukraine for a long time. And obviously, I see a lot of amazing students, UNC students, who are here to learn about Ukraine. So talking to you as a historian, as an academic, as a leader of a large academic research institution in the United States that's focused on Ukraine, how do we in this country bring Ukraine back into our academia? How do we help our academic institutions de-Russify and start teaching our kids also about Ukraine and other countries that you've mentioned in your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much for this question. And again, thanks certainly for everyone who supports Ukraine. And there are many ways to do that. The question of what can be or should be done in academia, there are discussions going on at the Association for Study of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, the largest academic organization and institution. There is this trend to talk about decolonization. So looking at the Russian and Soviet history through the prism, how the British or French history was rethought in the 60s and 70s. But generally, I want to say that we are dealing with the country that is extremely important geopolitically, but also historically. And Ukraine should be introduced in a much more profound way in our courses and our studies on Eastern Europe and Eurasia as well. Without Ukraine, it's difficult to understand good part of the history of the Russian Empire, and it's difficult to understand good part of East European history. Another important issue when it comes to the Slavic departments, and in most of the universities, for a number of reasons and very good reasons, okay, the lack of the interest, the low enrollments, and so on and so forth. What used to be Slavic departments before 1989 or 1990 became really Russian departments. And Ukraine is one of the cases, especially now, if you go there, it's not enough anymore to have just Russian or knowledge of Russian. And this is arguably plus minus compared to the Poles, is the second largest Slavic nation, which clearly is in the process of embracing language. So language is a key to any culture. Language and culture. So that's another direction. If you go beyond history, certainly you need expertise and linguistic and cultural expertise. Political scientists are traditionally the most flexible. They're just following the developments. If there is a Ukrainian state, they don't go into the 19th century or 11th century and try to question whether it exists or doesn't exist. Well, it exists. It is there. They take it. So I look at them a little bit as leaders in this process. For us, more conservative groups like historians and experts on culture and language and literature. I think that it's just a necessity given the conditions of the time, and it's certainly right thing to do on many levels. Not I know that it's tricky. Not expand the exposure to Ukraine in different versions at the expense of anybody else, but just enrich understanding of everybody else by exposure to Ukraine.
Good. Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor.
And many thanks to all those voices that we kept hearing.
You added a nice word for political science, which I don't hear very often. So
It was amazing. Thank you so much.